June 14, 2013, 7:12 a.m., Portland, Maine. A surgeon packed a carry-on, locked his front door, and drove toward I-95. By noon his rental car sat spotless at a turnout, wiped like a confession undone. What happened to Dr. Nathan Cole? 5 years later, August 23, 2018, 11:41 p.m., Phoenix, Arizona, something will surface under harsh lights and colder hands. The clock will argue with a failing pulse. The desert will lend no answers. Not yet. A buried message will breathe where it never should. The ER doors in Phoenix inhale the night and let it out in metallic drafts. Dr. Lila Moreno walks a gurney through the last corridor before the bright square of the operating room. Marco Alvarez is awake enough to fear the mask but too sick to refuse it. Fever beads on his hairline. His abdominal wall is tender, rigid, a map of pain drawn by someone who doesn't care about borders. Monitors begin their arguments. Oxygen. Blood pressure. A mean line drifting low. She hydrates him, orders cultures, calls anesthesia, and signs for a consent he can barely read. He nods anyway. The room narrows to field and steel. Her first incision is small, careful, the kind that can be closed again without bargaining. The tissue answers with heat and clouded fluid, infection that has taught itself to linger. She stretches the opening, finds adhesions, and begins to separate what sickness glued together. The plane is wrong. The feel is wrong. This is not a routine abscess. This is architecture, intentional, as if someone wanted inflammation to smolder, not explode. Her retractor clicks a notch deeper. Suction murmurs over the beeping. Time thins. She touches something that will not give. Not bone. Not calculus. Flat, too crisp, embedded like a decision no one questioned. She freezes, then angles her light. The surface is slick with fibrous sheath, a tan film grown by months of the body arguing with a stranger. She dissects the capsule edge millimeter by millimeter, avoiding bowel, teasing it free without tearing. The room stops talking. Even the vent sounds cautious. It lifts. Rectangular. Heavier than it should be. She rinses once, twice, watches the residue run tea-colored into the trap. She doesn't name it yet. She refuses to. She asks for a basin, places the thing into stainless steel, and irrigates again until plastic stares back. The laminate clears. A headshot blooms under hospital glare. A man in midlife, neat glasses, smile caught between duty and fatigue. The caption is plain, Maine Medical Center. Nathan Cole, MD, surgery. An expiration date that did not arrive in Phoenix. The air goes cold enough to feel like altitude. Moreno doesn't allow her eyes to rest on the name. She moves them back to the field, to clamps and cautery, to the wound that still demands closing. She is not a detective. She is the person between a stranger's heart rate and a flat line. She trims away the angry rind of tissue, irrigates again, seats a drain, and sutures with swift precision. She stamps orders for broad-spectrum antibiotics, for a bed that watches more closely than a nurse can. Only then does she lift the basin with two gloved hands, as if the plastic could jump. Her breath fogs the shield for the first time tonight. In the corridor, she meets fluorescent silence and a security officer she doesn't remember calling. He walks beside her without questions. The legal liaison is already waiting with a bag labeled biohazard because someone knew this wasn't an accident and never was. Moreno slides the basin into the bag. The lock clicks. The hum of the refrigerator down the hall suddenly sounds like a plane idling. She thinks of distance. She thinks of years that look like seconds when you stare at the wrong clock. On the monitor in recovery, Marco's numbers begin to climb out of the ditch. Not triumph. Not yet. But a turn. He sleeps because the body finally can. Moreno reviews his CT from admission. Surgical clips out of place with the story he gave, scarring that doesn't correspond to trauma he denies or can't remember. The radiology report hedges. Her hands don't. She has seen careful hands inside an abdomen before. This work was neat, elegant, controlled, then sabotaged by the very object that bore a stranger's face. She calls the night administrator. She calls the police. She dictates the operative note with the restraint of someone who knows words can become detonators. She does not speculate. She documents position, depth, adhesion, capsule, extraction time, condition of field. Facts. The questions pour in anyway. Who put this inside him? Why here? Why not somewhere fatal? Why someone else's name as the only breadcrumb? She stands at a window that overlooks the vacant helipad, the city spilling neon toward the edges of the desert. Portland is 3 time zones and 5 years away, yet close enough to lean against the glass. When Dr. Avery Cole arrives tomorrow, she will see the same photo everyone else sees and something entirely different. Routine badge, yes. Also a private habit, a duplicate card only 2 people ever talked about. The meaning will sharpen like a scalpel raised to light. Someone didn't leave a mistake. Someone staged a message with surgical skill and a clock attached. We are not there yet. For now, a patient breathes and a piece of plastic hums inside a bag near a refrigerator that never sleeps. Someone used a body to mail a cry for help. By late morning the next day, Dr. Avery Cole stood in a Phoenix conference room with a clear evidence bag sweating under fluorescent light. The badge inside looked ordinary until it didn't. Nathan's second ID, the one he kept for travel, the one she'd teased him about for being overly cautious. She didn't touch the bag. She traced the laminate with her eyes and counted her own breaths until the rhythm steadied. She had trained herself to live inside numbers, gas flows, MAC values, saturation curves, because numbers didn't lie when people did. Now the numbers formed a trail. She walked straight to radiology with the operative note and Marco Alvarez's scans. Artifact lines where there shouldn't be, suture symmetry that didn't match trauma. Whoever worked in there had the same habits Nathan once joked she could recognize blindfolded. Tissue planes that closed like a zipper. Knots that hid in the groove. Buried beneath was a design choice she couldn't ignore. Enough irritation to force an intervention, not enough to kill. Someone wanted this body to arrive at a table. Someone wanted a pair of trained eyes to find the message. Special Agent Jonah Reed of the FBI introduced himself with a paper cup of black coffee and a posture that suggested he slept in hallways. He didn't ask if the badge was real. He asked what kind of anesthetic residue could cling to fibrous tissue month after month. She told him desflurane could whisper its presence in trapped pockets, that rocuronium could leave a shadow where a careful chemist looked, that perfusion fluids used to move organs left their own quiet signatures. The lab downstairs began testing what the scalpel had freed, pipettes tapping like a metronome in another room. Reed slid a tablet across the table, a map returning a lattice of pale tracks over central Arizona. Most planes file their paths like law-abiding citizens. Some don't. He'd pulled public ADSB returns and overlaid them with gaps, then layered in fuel delivery receipts for remote generators, bulk orders of oxygen, medical-grade vaporizers routed through Helios Relief Network, a humanitarian nonprofit that kept immaculate records and a suspiciously high inventory. Preparedness, the Helios rep had claimed when the hospital requested a usage verification last spring. Preparedness didn't explain invoices for specialized chilling units and a borehole permit in Scrubland. Avery read the permit number twice, then caught her reflection in the tablet. Deserts don't hide water without help. A surgical facility didn't run on sunshine and hope. It needed power that didn't blink, water that didn't foul, refrigeration that didn't fail when a compressor hiccuped. Someone had built a nerve center where no one would bother to look, then taught it to look like nothing at all. They walked the Helios lobby that afternoon, Reed with his questions, Avery with her silence. Glass, plants, murals of smiling patients. Evelyn Slate, who the staff called executive director, who introduced herself with a hand that didn't tremble, spoke in the precise calm of someone who understood what instruments do under stress. She wasn't wearing scrubs, but her room awareness felt OR-born. Reed asked about supply anomalies. She gave him policy. He asked about clinic throughput. She gave him outreach photos. Avery said almost nothing, but she watched Slate as a ventilator watcher watches a chest rise. For the subtle miss, the intake that comes a beat late. She caught it when Slate deflected a question about vaporizers by naming a model only a clinician would know. Back at the hospital, the day turned thin and brittle. Security posted outside Marco's room while he rode his early improvement like a fragile raft. The nurse on duty, exhausted but alert, called Avery when two men in orderly uniforms arrived with a clipboard stamped with a transfer authorization Avery had not signed. The font spacing was perfect, the signature was not. The men insisted. The police officer beside the nurse shifted his weight and didn't move his hand from his belt. The men recalculated, then retreated with their politeness intact and their failure not. Avery's phone rang with lab results as the elevator doors closed on the imposters. Trace desflurane in the fibrous capsule that had wrapped the card. Trace rocuronium microbound to protein fragments. Not a hospital's profile. A private stock with money behind it. Reed's team cross-checked purchase logs and found Helios had quietly acquired replacement vaporizers for the exact agent Avery now smelled in data. Preparedness again, but the numbers nipped at the story's edges. She returned to the evidence bag in the legal office and stood with it like people stand with grave markers, saying nothing into air that carries more than you want it to. She made herself remember Nathan's last morning in Maine not as a myth but as a sequence. The coffee mug ring on the counter, the folded itinerary he always pretended to skim, the kiss that promised ordinary. She let the memory hurt, because pain is better than fiction when you're trying to see straight. Then she turned to the whiteboard Reed had claimed and pointed at the only open stretch. If the facility needs water, it will sit on an aquifer they can reach without hauling. If it needs to disappear by daylight, it will use a dirt strip with a line of sight shielded by ridges. Start there. He nodded like he'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Agents began drawing circles around Phoenix with a 1-hour flight time and crossing them with USGS groundwater data and diesel delivery routes. A cluster formed between Gila Bend and the dark land that keeps its own secrets. No one called it proof. No one had to. The shape of it felt like a door. Night came with the smell of cooled asphalt and overwatered landscaping. Avery sat in the visitor chair outside Marco's room and watched the second-hand jerk and reset, because sometimes hope looks exactly like that. She didn't pray. She made a list of what they would need that a desert bunker couldn't predict. Time, patience, and a reason for the person holding the gun to think the person on the table mattered more than leverage. She looked at the badge through glass one last time and understood what Nathan had risked to send a message in a place that steals messages. They had been given a thread. They would pull until something tore. Someone had already decided the clock was too slow. They were about to try again. Helios Relief Network's headquarters in Phoenix looked like a promise dressed in glass. Morning heat hammered the courtyard, but inside it was cool, curated, and mercifully quiet. A wall of backlit photographs lined the lobby. Clinics in storms, tents after quakes, faces turned toward relief that didn't always arrive. Special Agent Jonah Reed signed the visitor log with a steady hand and a name badge that said consultant. Dr. Avery Cole stood beside him, the badge on her lapel blank by design. She felt the faint hum of the building in her sternum the way anesthesiologists feel pressure changes before they hear them. Relief organizations love sunlight. This one loved reflection. Evelyn Slate met them with a boardroom smile and a grip that anchored, not crushed. She was tall, careful in motion, a calm that knew where every exit was. She called herself executive director, thanked them for coming, and offered coffee with an ease that looked earned. Reed declined. Avery accepted and didn't drink. Slate spoke about deployments, supply caches, and the ethical burden of triage when roads collapse. She did not flinch at questions about compliance or audits. She offered a binder that weighed honesty. It also weighed like a performance. Avery watched the small things. Slate's sleeves hid faint, parallel impressions on the forearms where, over years, elastic cuffing from sterile gowns will leave memory. When Reed mentioned vaporizers, Slate named a high-end model and a service interval without checking notes. Not impossible for an administrator. Not typical either. She pivoted to procurement as if stepping around an imaginary four-pole. Her language preferred verbs that move hands. Clamp, secure, isolate. The mural light caught the glass and wrote a second Slate across the floor. People tell their history by accident. Reed asked to reconcile inventory. Helios had ordered desflurane-compatible vaporizers and oxygen manifolds suitable for fixed installations, not field tents. They showed receipts for replacement parts. Preparedness, Slate said, because modern disasters now last months. He asked about chilling units rated for organ transport and why a relief network purchased 2 more than regional usage demanded. Partnerships with transplant centers, she said, voice leveled on policy ground. He nodded like a man letting rope play. He didn't mention the borehole permit Helios had filed for land west of Gila Bend under a shell entity with a mailbox and no staff. The tour moved past a logistics bay where pallets sat wrapped in plastic and sunlight. Labels read sterile drapes, vent circuits, preservation solution. A forklift idled. On a high shelf, Avery spotted crates stenciled with a manufacturer she knew for perfusion pumps. A nurse's habit pushed her closer. Slate's body eased subtly between them and the aisle, creating a polite boundary. Reed asked about the pumps. Slate praised redundancy, disaster readiness, cross-border cooperation. Her voice never stumbled. Her eyes measured the distance to the loading dock and back. They signed out after an hour and a half of answers that fit. Once in the car, Reed turned the binder so the spine faced up, a dog waiting to be fed later. She knew the vaporizer model, he said, not congratulating, not surprised. And the service interval, Avery answered, tracing a finger over the dashboard seam. That's muscle memory, not policy. They drove to a low-slung warehouse on the city's south side where a pallet broker moved last-mile freight. A friendly manager showed invoices that tied Helios to bulk diesel deliveries not billed to the headquarters. The diesel went to a yard that serviced no known clinic. The yard paid cash. A camera outside had a bad angle, a useful kind of wrong. Reed's team lifted plate numbers from a different block and built a lattice of comings and goings around nothing at all. His phone buzzed with an email from D. Cross-check complete. Helios received 3 vaporizers through a distributor who also supplied an unlisted entity called Aridus Environmental. Aridus had no clinic license. It had a dirt lease in land that preferred to keep its own counsel. By late afternoon they were back in the hospital, the building that measured truth in milliliters and minutes. Marco Alvarez dozed with a guard by the door and a nurse charting precise things that hold people together. Avery reviewed his labs and a new CT post-drain. Less fluid. Fewer shadows. A small corner turned. She stared at the image and felt a familiar pull. How healing can be both proof and trap. If someone staged a message inside a human body, someone else could stage a rescue with a ticking clock. She glanced at the evidence bag in legal, the badge sleeping in fogged plastic. Some objects are louder in silence. An analyst from Reed's team appeared at the nurse's station with a laptop and a face that said there was music in the noise. He had run Spectrum recording pulled from a ham operator west of Buckeye who liked to search for storms with his antenna. At 2:13 that morning, a burst hit, short, clipped, unlicensed, too clean for farm chatter. 3 words hid in the compression when the static was peeled back. Sterilize the site. No coordinates. No names. Just a command. The analyst hit play. The phrase landed like a hand on the back of the neck. Avery closed her eyes and saw wind carving an unseen runway through scrub as neatly as a suture through skin, then opened them because the time for guesses was over and the clock had chosen sides. Someone who understood surgery had built a place that understood erasing. Someone else had left a map that could not wait. At dusk the desert looked harmless, all lavender edges and slow air, but the command tent breathed like a lung under pressure. Screens glowed in rows, each a different way of seeing the same emptiness. Special Agent Jonah Reed stood hip to a folding table while a geospatial analyst drew careful circles around Phoenix, the radius of a small plane that didn't want to be remembered. They pared away what the desert refused. No ranch roads. No public wells. No towers throwing their blinking confessions across the night. The footprint that remained sat between Gila Bend and a smear of federal land as featureless as sleep. Avery Cole watched the layers stack. Public ADSB tracks in gray. Unregistered pings that looked like hiccups in the sky. Fuel delivery ledgers that wandered into cache. USGS groundwater maps with their shy blue shadings. A weak seam ran north of a basalt ridge, a formation that broke wind the way a seawall breaks weather. A dirt strip could hide there. Generators could purr. A vent stack could disappear into rock shadow and heat haze. She pictured air moving through ductwork the way she pictured gases moving through a circuit. Resistance, turbulence, the steady hunger of a machine meant to keep someone else alive. They pulled fresh satellite stills. Daylight showed nothing. Night was kinder, a stub of thermal bright that flickered like breath through a crack. The analyst overlaid an older image. The bright stub wasn't there last winter. It was new or newly careless. Reed's hand tapped the table twice, a quiet yes to no one. He parceled out teams to set eyes on the ridge from 3 angles before moonrise. No hero runs, no chatter, no light. If the place existed, it would see before it was seen. They had to become part of the wind. In the ambulance bay back in Phoenix, a surgeon's note and a plastic badge had changed the air, and now the air changed with them. Avery built a list on a whiteboard with a felt tip that bled slightly against the gloss. If there was a surgical suite below ground, it would have oxygen lines under pressure, volatile anesthetic on tap or in reach, suction drawing a path to nowhere. It would have a rhythm it believed in. If a standoff came, a gun would be the loudest thing in the room, but it wouldn't be the most important. The organ on the table would be. She drew a box for leverage and wrote the word organ in a clear hand. She drew another box for time and wrote the word failure. The two meet in the same minute. At 21:07, a team on the ridge whispered their first sighting, a graded swath too straight for weather, tamped like a track. No tire ruts. No vehicles in the open. Heat signatures low to the ground as if engines hid behind berms. The team leader stopped talking to the radio and talked to his own pulse instead. Reed hovered over the map and began to shrink the search to a fist. He didn't ask Avery if she was sure about the wind. He let the mountain answer for her. They placed long ears in the sage. A faint whine rose and fell as if a generator strained under a changing load, then steadied when the air cooled. A coughed syllable of VHF traffic tried to run and failed. The analyst with the laptop built a quick and dirty model of power draw, translating noise into need. Below them, if below was the right word for hell turned clinical, something was consuming power like a hospital does when it believes morning will happen. Avery stepped away from the noise and wrote out a sequence of what-ifs, the kind that keep people alive in rooms built to control them. If a complex transplant had begun, there would be a cascade, anticoagulation, warmed fluids, vasopressors that walked a ledge. If panic visited, the cascade would slip. Blood pressure would whistle down. End tidal would drift. The ventilator would punish a leak like a judge punishes contempt. The person with the gun would feel very large until numbers started to die. Then the room would belong, briefly, to whoever could count fastest and calmest. She wasn't trying to be brave. She was trying to be useful. By 22:50, the long lens team caught movement at a cut in the ground. A door that rolled, not opened. A strange truck with a box behind the cab pulled nose out, idled, and then reversed back underground. No plates. No glare. Doors closed. The ridge returned to its impersonation of nothing. Reed exhaled in a way that made the tent fabric twitch. He asked for a drone with a quiet heart and no ego. The drone rose like an apology and settled to watch heat, deciding how to leave the earth. The FBI's crisis negotiator arrived with the weariness of a man who'd learned to listen to seconds. He and Reed argued gently about thresholds, about how much proof they needed before they knocked, about whether knocking was even the right verb for a place that had practiced disappearing. Avery said little until it mattered, then pointed at the whiteboard where she had written leverage and failure. "If he's down there and a patient is open," she said, not saying Nathan's name, "the person in charge will protect the outcome that pays. We can make the numbers their leash." At 23:38, an infrared panel view flickered into the tent on a new screen none of them had asked for. Grained. Bright figures moving over an island of white. A metal table. A figure masked and gowned, thinner than memory, hands steady out of habit, not hope. Another figure a half step away with a pistol lifted just enough to bully. No one said the name because names make people real when you need them to be work. The gunman turned toward the camera as if the camera were a mirror, and the picture juddered, then steadied, then held. Someone had just invited them in. Someone else had decided who would walk out. The feed held steady long enough for breath to hurt. A room bright as noon underground. Stainless counters. a ventilator drawing its mechanical size. The masked surgeon at the table moved with a discipline that outlived hope, hands exact, economy in every reach. Nathan. The pistol tracked him like a metronome with malice. To the left, a woman in lead gray scrubs stood outside the sterile field, her posture running the show without raising her voice. Evelyn Slate had shed the boardroom but not the control. Special Agent Jonah Reed slid a headset on and nodded to the crisis negotiator. The first call went out on a channel Slate could not pretend to ignore. He introduced himself, offered safe surrender, promised medical evacuation for any patient on the table. Slate answered with a calm that sounded practiced in mirrors. "You will back off," she said, "or your surgeon and my patient die together." The words were flat, not shouted. Her leverage wasn't the gun. It was the organ on the table and the money pledged to its survival. Avery Cole leaned toward the screen, not to see faces but numbers. The monitor in the corner was a soft constellation: arterial line, oxygen saturation, end-tidal CO2, rhythm that had started to fray at the edges. Too many fluids, too little tone. The vent loop showed a leak more insistent than a loose connection. "They're drifting," she said quietly. "She needs this to succeed, or none of her threats pay." Reed nodded once. The negotiator offered what Slate could not buy: a specialist who could stabilize the anesthetic storm by voice alone. Silence met the offer. Money counts, so does fear of losing it. When Slate came back, her voice had a thin wire in it. "Speak," she said, "and be quick." Reed opened the line. Avery stepped into a role she did not ask for and had trained for anyway. She didn't say Nathan's name. She listed actions as if dictating to a resident across a crowded or increase norepinephrine to a low, precise rate. Slow the fluids. Check the cuff pressure. Watch the capnography for a rise that signals a better seal. She folded a message into a dosage and hit a command in a size. 10 liters. 50 milligrams. 7 millimeters. Not random numbers. The shorthand married couples make by accident over years. Nathan's gaze flicked once toward the camera and then away. Recognition isn't a smile. It's a change in speed. "Good," Slate said, "more to the money than to the medicine. Continue." The patient's pressure obeyed like a tired animal stubbornly willing to stand. The capnography rounded. The rhythm quit flirting with panic. Time re-entered the room with a price tag. Avery saw the vent loop settle and felt the minute she had asked for slide into their hands. She shifted tone, returned to a cool cadence that let Slate hear the thing she needed to hear most: that success was still purchasable if she allowed it. "You'll need to resuture the hepatic vein cuff after the next step," Avery said evenly, as if this were a surgical debrief and not a hostage call. "Prep your team for suction surge." Then what Slate did not hear: "Now." The word arrived as a number disguised as habit. Nathan's hand found the oxygen line at the junction that every anesthesiologist can touch blind. A twist. A pull. A shriek of pressurized air like an animal, sudden and everywhere. The camera washed white with vapor the way storms erase horizon lines. The pistol convulsed toward noise. A tray slid. Alarms stacked voices. Reed's finger cut toward the breach team before the sound finished folding. Charges on the hidden hatch coughed the desert open. Operators poured through choke points with the economy of men who had rehearsed this geography too many times in too many cities. The first pair hit smoke and heat and a door that hadn't been designed to keep them out, only to keep the world from knowing what lived inside. They ate 3 seconds of blindness, then a hallway, then the room. Slate swung her aim, fast, committed, and late. A shield took her first shot into its belly and carried her backward into the corner that had looked like command. She went down hard, breath leaving like confession. Hands found her wrists. Plastic clicked where jewelry had rested. A second element split for the table. The operator nearest Nathan didn't speak. He covered the weapon that lay stupid and hot on the tile. The medic slid to the head of the bed, eyes on the waveform, voice Darwin calm. "We're here." Nathan didn't look up. He clamped, tied, and nodded as if finishing belonged to him even now. Avery heard Reed's "asset secure" without understanding it at first. The phrase was too small for what the screen showed. The patient's pressure held. The vent loop became boring again. Boring is life. Slate started talking only when the room stopped. She asked for a lawyer, then a deal, then for the lights to be turned away from her face. No one negotiated. Men with cameras stepped around her like she was furniture a landlord would repossess. The feed wobbled as the drone adjusted for heat it hadn't expected to survive. Reed took off his headset and didn't celebrate. He checked his watch. Outside, the ridge swallowed the noise as if the desert had been practicing for this moment for centuries. Avery did not let herself cry. She watched Nathan breathe through his mask, a small tremor in his fingers betraying what the screen could not measure. Numbers hummed. People moved. The room reset to plausible. Somewhere above them the wind scraped at rock and carried the evidence away. Somewhere else a list of names and wire transfers waited behind a door with the wrong lock. She understood the rescue was not the end, it was the first clean incision. Dawn hauled itself over the Sonoran like a body pulling from anesthesia. Helicopter rotors stitched the horizon. Nathan lay on the stretcher under a thermal blanket, eyes open but drifting, the old habit of scanning a room returning in jittered fragments. Avery walked beside the gurney with one hand on the rail, anchoring him to this side of air. He tried to say something, the words fractured. She bent close and felt his breath gather. Not gone, he managed, the syllables dry as sand. The medic smiled without looking up from the vitals. Not gone was enough for the ride. In Phoenix the bunker became evidence before it cooled. Photographers stepped through corridors where the floor still remembered boots. A whiteboard listed donor numbers beside initials that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Reed's team found the ledger slate protected more than any guard, transfers disguised as humanitarian shipments, parts of people cataloged with the indifference of inventory. In a side room a cheap radio sat tuned to an open band, the one that had carried sterilized the site like a whisper from nowhere. It was still warm. Nathan's first nights in the ICU were a negotiation with ghosts. His hands shook when the blood pressure cuff inflated. His eyes avoided the ventilator in the next bay. The staff tucked him in a corner room where the clock couldn't bully, and Avery read him charts instead of stories. He slept in falls, woke in cliffs. The tremor eased when he recognized the sound of the hallway ice machine, ordinary as rain. On the third day he asked for a pen. The letters came slow, horizoned, but his name bent true. He looked at it for a long minute like it belonged to someone he could learn to be again. Marco Alvarez sat up 2 floors below, healing into the strange new quiet of a body without an alarm. He asked to meet the man whose hands had hurt him and saved him in the same decade. They spoke with the awkwardness of people who had shared a room without sharing a life. Marco described the role of the underground door, the count he couldn't forget, the calm of the woman who gave orders like weather. Nathan listened until listening tugged his stitches and said he was sorry without decoration. Marco nodded once. "You left a map," he said, "so I could leave a door open." Forgiveness didn't arrive, it grew. By autumn the indictments ran longer than the valley's heat. Serena Vale, operating as Evelyn Slate, faced what paper can carry when witnesses stand up beside it. Former contractors flipped. A pilot traded hours for names. The ledger drew lines across borders, then across oceans. Reed's casework crawled into rooms that smelled like new carpet and closed them. A few clients tried to vanish into money surrendered for fear of air. In court Slate kept her spine as straight as it had been in the bunker. She asked for counsel, then mercy, then only the right to speak uninterrupted. The jury listened to facts that did not raise their voices. Life without parole removed the need for adjectives. Avery did not return to the oar. She started instead with the small rooms where rules live: procurement meetings, hospital boards, state committees that decide which paper asks which questions. She chased gaps in supply logs and made vendors show their math. She visited training programs and talked about how criminals borrow the posture of medicine and how medicine must learn to look past posture. She spoke without sermon and left before applause. In the evenings she and Nathan walked a gentle loop around the block in Portland that kept them close enough to home to retreat if memory tried to ambush. It tried less often. Nathan did not attempt to operate again. He began to teach. Students leaned forward when he explained anatomy as language and ethics as its grammar. He told them how hands learn to be clever and must be taught to be kind, how precision without conscience can turn any room into a bunker. He never told the story in full. He carried it like a scar carries weather, answering what he could and refusing the rest. Refusal was a skill too. A year after the raid, Marco took a seat in a federal courtroom, raised his right hand, and said the part no one else could say. He left out the last hour. He didn't owe that to strangers. After, he walked out into sun so sharp it felt like a clean instrument and looked up until the brightness stopped feeling like punishment. He had learned that surviving is not an apology, it is a vote to keep walking. On a winter morning back in Maine, Avery opened a drawer and found Nathan's old lanyard, the chewed clip, the habit of caution, the joke they used to make about over-preparedness. She hung it on a coat hook by the door. Not as a shrine. As a promise to notice. The house made one of its familiar small sounds, the heat kicking on like a heart deciding. She reached for Nathan's hand, felt the tremor almost gone, and counted the seconds out loud until he smiled and joined the count. In the end, the lesson was spare. Truth is slow, but it keeps a direction. People will use science to harm and to heal. The difference is whether someone is watching the numbers and the faces at the same time. If a signal looks like clutter, look again. And when you can't forgive yourself yet, do the next kind thing anyway. Sometimes mercy grows from motion.